it's a great pleasure to introduce Jayden Engert. He's a PhD student in Bill Lawrence's lab at James Cook University. Has been in that lab for a number of years in associated labs as a geospatial technician, then as a master's student, and then recently begun his PhD. And we were chatting just earlier, and in some ways this is the most depressing but the most important sorts of subjects to work on, right? This is the front line of conservation, and Jayden's been applying some of the latest analytical techniques to try to understand patterns of habitat change and deforestation. So I'll hand over to Jayden to take us through his work. Thank you very much, Jayden.
Thank you, Rich, for the introduction. As Rich said, my name is Jayden Engert. I'm a PhD with Bill's group up in Cairns as part of the Global Roadmap. And today I'm going to be presenting about ghost roads and how they influence the survival of tropical forests. And this is work that has also involved a lot of help from Mason Campbell, Saurabh Das, Mohammed Alamgir, Sean Sloan, Yoko Ishida, Jamie Huther, and of course, Professor William Lawrence. I'll just give you a very quick introduction about myself. I did a Bachelor of Science at JCU and a Master's in Protected Area Management, also at JCU. And then after that, I spent 2 years working as a geospatial technician on various different projects, including NEST projects and importantly, the Global Roadmap, which is Bill's project. And currently I'm a PhD student under Bill Lawrence and Will Edwards, and I will be looking at predicting future impacts of these infrastructure developments. So the reason we're focusing on roads is that these massive development projects are proliferating across the globe, and especially in tropical countries that have not maybe been subjected to the same kind of development to date. So we have the COSI plan in South America, which is a massive program to integrate and develop new infrastructure to connect the entire continent. And then you also have the program for development in Africa, which is the same sort of scheme across the whole continent of Africa, as well as these important development corridors in Indonesia, Malaysia, and PNG, and of course the Belt and Road across most of Europe and parts of Africa as well, and Asia. And there are already lots of new roads or unmapped roads in these important tropical regions, and in the future there's going to be even more. So the International Energy Agency estimates that by 2013, there'll be about 25 million kilometers of new roads. Sorry, by 2050, there'll be that. And 90% of these are going to be in developing areas that haven't been subjected to development. As part of COSI plan in South America, that's 138 new road projects. In the Asia Pacific region where we have been working, there's already been 250,000 kilometers of new roads since the year 2000, and there is proposals for another 20,000 kilometers of these new large-scale projects. And in Africa, there is also another 193 new transport projects, and that's going to total over 50,000 kilometers of new roads. And that's on top of all these hundreds of thousands of kilometers of new roads in the Congo Basin, logging roads, hunting trails, things like that. And these roads can have dramatic environmental impacts. The most obvious ones are the direct impacts, things like roadkill, disturbances to soil and hydrology, as well as roads acting as barriers to dispersal, migration routes of animals, all sorts of things like that. But even more important in terms of scale are the indirect impacts. So by allowing access to these previously inaccessible wilderness areas, roads facilitate all sorts of hunting and poaching, all sorts of different resource extraction, either legal or illegal, things like logging and mining. And they also facilitate the spread of fires because they create a drier, warmer microclimate. And that's a big concern in places like the Amazon, the Congo Basin as well.
It seems to sound a bit low.
Okay. Does the sound a bit better now? Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. And even more important potentially are the cumulative impacts, which is when you combine all of these roads into a network, they result in a lot of habitat fragmentation, as well as contributing to large-scale land cover change, and also just facilitating more and more roads. So this impacts just keep compounding on top of each other. And this figure on the right here is this same location in Borneo, just 12 years apart. And you can see the change in the amount of roads and deforestation once those first roads have been developed. On top of these obvious environmental impacts, there are also many different socioeconomic impacts, especially in these developing regions. Things like the cost of long-term road maintenance. And the World Bank study in Papua New Guinea recently found that the investment needed to maintain a road in a tropical region is about 20% of the initial cost every year. So after about 5 years, you're paying for a whole nother road in that same area. As well as things like landslide and sedimentation, which can affect river flows and impact people's livelihoods, as well as just simply being a serious source of mortality in some regions. And the roads can also facilitate social unrest and conflict by bringing in all of these illegal miners, illegal poachers and things like that, and creating tension with the local communities. And something that is gaining a lot more attention now in the age of the COVID pandemic is the spread of disease and invasive species. And these roads also often have associated with a lot of corruption, and there are unequal economic benefits. So especially in places like Indonesia, there is often lots of benefits to large corporations or people associated with these corporations, and the benefits to actual local populations can be much smaller. And you also have things like stolen revenues from illegal logging, and there are estimates that that costs billions of dollars to the Indonesian government every year from logging that is not recorded, just the money not going back into the government. And many of these projects also just simply have long-term economic risks and hidden costs and hidden losses. Yeah, since we're in the age of the pandemic right now, it's very important to also mention that roads can promote the emergence of new pathogens by facilitating all sorts of different processes that bring human populations into contact with these new pathogens. Things like urbanization and deforestation, bushmeat consumption, and land cover conversion have all been shown to facilitate emergence and spillover events. So I'll also explain what actually are ghost roads, since it's the title of my topic, probably a good idea to cover that. In 2014, a study by Barber et al. Found that about 75% of the roads in the Amazon, the Brazilian Amazon, were illegal or unofficial. So there's lots of these unmapped roads in all sorts of different parts of the world. More recently, Sean Sloan in our group and a bunch of others found that about 65% of roads in the Lusa ecosystem in Sumatra were also unmapped or illegal. And at the start of this year, I did a study on the Harapan forest in Sumatra, which is one of the last areas of remaining lowland rainforest on the island of Sumatra. And I found that about 75% of the roads in and around this forest were unmapped in the previous data sets. And we also have hundreds of thousands of unmapped logging roads in the Congo Basin. So why might these roads be absent from existing data sets? The majority of these roads are constructed either illegally or unofficially. So things being constructed just without government approvals. They may also be roads that do not fit the dataset definition. So things like logging roads and hunting trails can often not be considered roads by groups such as Google Earth or national governments. They can even just be roads that were constructed after the dataset was actually created. And sometimes they're roads that are too small to be mapped, or roads that are not visible from satellite imagery or ground truthing. And we focused our attention on the Asia Pacific region, being Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea, because this is an incredibly important region for biodiversity. It has 3 biodiversity hotspots plus the island of New Guinea, which is a hotspot for endemism, especially in plants. And this region is also very important for carbon storage and water cycling. It has lots of high carbon value forests and peatlands. And it also has a very large and growing population. So there is a growing need for development to improve living standards and reduce poverty. The work that we've been doing to date has involved lots of manually digitizing these unmapped roads. So basically we draw them in Google Earth on top of the existing road maps. So it's a lot of manual labor involved in this. And we've to date mapped about 2 million square kilometers of the region. And this has involved contributions from many volunteers, about 82 to date, I think, plus myself, Yoko Ishida and Jamie Huzza. And obviously this manual digitization is a massive challenge, especially in areas where there's a lot of development. These road networks are highly dynamic. So if you're mapping on imagery that is a few years old, by the time we get new imagery, there might even be more roads there again. And this is also an area where satellite imagery is often very poor. Often have to use the Landsat imagery, or the imagery is hidden by clouds, or the best high quality imagery is 5 to 10 years old. So there are still some limitations to this technique, but it is still important that someone goes through and do this. And we are finding lots and lots of unmapped roads. So this image here is a bit of an extreme example, but that red line you see in the middle is the road that is in the existing government database. And the yellow lines in the next still is all the roads that we manually map in this area. So we have mapped manually 400,000 kilometers of roads, which brings the total total length of roads in this area to about 1 million kilometers. And just the roads that we have manually digitized is roughly double the length of all of the roads in the Congo Basin. So there's lots and lots of unmapped roads in these areas. And what this translates into is that the most widely used global road data sets severely underestimate the amount of roads in these areas. So the Global Road Inventory Project, GRIP, we have found about 5.5 times more roads than is in this data set. And the most recent iteration of OpenStreetMap has about half the amount of roads. And these numbers vary between different regions, as you can see from these graphs here. In Malaysian Borneo, for example, the actual amount of roads in our mapped regions is about 30 times higher than what is in the GRIP dataset. And for this region, the GRIP dataset is the official data. So that means we've mapped about 30 times more roads than is in official databases. And this also translates to lots of areas that people would expect to not have roads, having roads in them. So in the smaller figure here, you can see the actual amount of 1 square kilometer cells that contain roads. And you can see that for Sumatra, more than half of the region is within 1 kilometer of a road. Whereas if you were considering only the GRIP data set, you would say it's about 20% of the region. And then to assess the relationship between these roads and forest cover, we use the global forest change data from the Maryland lab in Andrew Hansen's lab. And we mapped the 2 million most recently deforested cells. And we simply just calculated the distance to the nearest road. And to also see what other factors might drive this forest loss, we ran a GLM. This is work from Saurabh Das, who has helped out on this a lot. We use a whole bunch of different correlates that may explain forest cover, such as things like slope, distance to city, protected area coverage, population density. We also included 2 different ways to quantify the road network, one being a spatial variable and the distance to the nearest road, and one being the localized road density, which was just the amount of road in each 1 square K cell. And what we found was that about 80.5% of all deforested cells in our study region were within 1 kilometre of a road, and about 38% were within 100 metres. So obviously deforestation occurs in very close proximity to roads in these regions. And this varies between the different areas. So less developed areas such as New Guinea, the relationship is less obvious. In Papua New Guinea, for example, I think it was about 32% of deforestation occurred within 1 kilometre of a road. But in places like Malaysia and Borneo, it was actually 95% of the forest loss occurred within 1 kilometre of a road. And we also compared the figures from our road data set to the two existing road data sets. And we found that these existing data sets often don't properly capture the relationship between roads and forest loss. So when you look at, again, the GRIP data set, you find that only about 42% of the deforestation occurred within 1 kilometre of one of these roads. So that's about half of what is the true value. So this is telling us that these existing data sets probably underestimate the influence of roads on forest cover, as well as all sorts of other environmental impacts like poaching, mining, things like that. And we also found from our modelling exercise that distance to road and slope were the two most important drivers of forest loss. And again, you have very similar response curves for the two more developed regions, being Sumatra and Borneo. And the island of New Guinea has a much less pronounced relationship between distance to road and forest loss. For Sumatra, the relationship is quite linear, and I would expect that that is due to the area we are mapping being Aceh and North Sumatra. Areas that are either lowlands and completely developed and cleared, or they're topographically complex sloping areas or mountainous areas that are still quite intact. So in these instances, slope becomes more important because the road construction is also related to slope. And when we ran these models for each region individually to see which were the most important variables in regions, we found that in the less developed areas, like New Guinea and Indonesian Borneo, distance to road became much more important. But when you're looking at just the highly developed areas like Sumatra and Malaysian Borneo, slope was the much more important variable. And again, this is probably because in these areas, all of the lowland forest has already been cleared. So then slope becomes the limiting factor in what is deforested and what is not. So the two most important conclusions from this work is that these existing road maps, the GRIP dataset and the OpenStreetMap dataset, massively underestimate the extent of human impacts, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is things like deforestation, poaching. These roadmaps also underestimate the influence of roads on the human impacts. So you might not get as tight a prediction from roads as you would expect. We can extrapolate this to show how this affects different measures of conservation importance, things like the human footprint. These maps were for 2009, so that you have to remember that, but you can see that when you include all of these extra unmapped roads, the median human footprint across Eastern Kalimantan triples from 3 to 9. And there are a whole bunch more regions that are under some level of human impact. When you're also considering different measures such as roadless or wilderness areas, again, if you're looking at Eastern Kalimantan here, you can see that about 20% more of the region is within 1 kilometre of a road. So there's a substantial amount of the area that is not roadless when you actually consider all these hidden roads. And we can also apply this to specific species to assess the impacts of roads to different species. Things like tigers, which have been studied recently. If you compare the GRIP road dataset to our road dataset, you can see that there are significantly more roads in and around these tiger conservation landscapes when you consider all of these unmapped ghost roads. So these figures here show for the 3 tiger conservation landscapes in northern Sumatra, the amount of roads that are actually there versus the amount that are considered to be there in the GRIP data set. And these, as an example, these roadmaps also underestimate the influence of roads on human impacts. So efforts to predict the locations and drivers of different threats might underestimate the impact of roads, especially things like deforestation and poaching and hunting have been modeled using roads and other covariates. So what our results are saying is that these sorts of analyses might underestimate the importance of roads for these threats. And since these road impacts are occurring over varying spatial scales, it's not just the localized road density that is important in predicting forest loss. This means that when we're designing new road development projects, we have to consider more than just the footprint of the project itself. We also have to consider its place in the landscape, because these road impacts are going to spill over across large areas. So this is a serious concern for people who are proposing to make sustainable or green development projects, because it doesn't matter how sustainable the highway itself might be, these effects can spill out over varying different spatial scales. So from this, we can say that something that's going to be very important in the future is to minimize new road incursions into intact or pristine habitats. Unfortunately, a lot of these massive global development plans will intersect many different protected areas and conservation regions. In the Asia Pacific, for example, the proposed development corridors from the different national governments will interact with 195 different protected areas and conservation conservation priority forests, sorry. And in Africa, the different projects as part of the development plan will intersect 400 different protected areas, and they will impact indirectly another 1,800 protected areas. So these are very serious figures when you're considering the future of these protected areas. And South America, I don't have an exact number, but there are also numerous different protected areas that will have some influence from these proposed developments. Okay, so what are the future directions of this? I'm getting close to the end, so I'll rush through this pretty quickly. Essentially, we need to develop a different strategy to detect all these roads, because we can't keep manually mapping the roads forever. The reason most people are using these global data sets is because to do this mapping yourself is a massive undertaking, and it's really not practical for everyone to do. So we really need to develop some sort of automation strategy for this. And often, as we are mapping these roads, we are mapping slower than new roads are being developed, especially in frontier regions like Indonesian Borneo and Indonesian Papua. So currently there are already different research groups and corporations working on these projects. Different satellite imagery companies such as Maxar and Planet have developed algorithms to do this, but it's a bit too expensive for most conservation groups to access. And most of the scientific literature on these topics focuses on urban roads because they are much simpler to map. They're often very linear, they're often bitumen, so they stand out from the landscape. Whereas the rural and urban roads, often all sorts of different colors depending on soil composition, whether they've had gravel added on top or all sorts of other different factors. And they're much less linear. You get lots of cyclical patterns and all sorts of crazy different road network shapes. And they can even just be hidden under the tree canopy or things like that. We currently have a student in the lab named Rian Talkani, who is working on this rural road detection with his supervisor, Kevin Huang. And hopefully their work will be able to push forward these ideas. I'll be very quick on this, but there are two different ways that we can do this sort of automatic road detection. One is pixel-based classification, which is actually trying to get the exact location of a road, which allows us to calculate road lengths, road densities, and all these sorts of things. It can be difficult to do on low resolution imagery, and it can be difficult to do at large spatial scales, on small roads, things like that. And the other alternative to this is image or scene-based classification. And this is taking an image and saying, is there a road in it somewhere? And we can do this with much lower resolution imagery, such as imagery that is available as part of the Planet NICFI partnership. But then you have the question of what sort of scale should we be working at? How big does the scene need to be to classify roads accurately, but also keep the relationship to different impacts? So this is an area that will probably become a big area of future research for this sort of work. In the current term though, what can we do about these ghost roads? Well, we have to understand that a lot of these proposed large-scale projects are going to go ahead in some form or another. So it's going to be important to identify areas that are likely to be prone to significant road expansion and land cover change. And then to develop proactive conservation measures and proactively protect at-risk areas. And another strategy that has been proved to be successful in the past is to propose alternative routes for the projects in order to minimize impacts and also potentially minimize the construction costs. So in conclusion, these ghost roads are abundant all across tropical regions. The two best global road datasets substantially underestimate the amount of roads in the tropics, and excluding these roads also means we are severely underestimating the extent of and scale of human impacts in the tropics. Because of this, there's an urgent need to develop different methods to automatically map these ghost roads. So in short, they're a crucial threat to tropical forests and they're often poorly considered. Thank you for listening to my presentation. And if you have any interest in contributing to our work, you can visit our website.